The air hung thick with the promise of rain as Claire adjusted her backpack, casting one last uneasy glance at the horizon. A mass of clouds drifted toward the little town, but the storm seemed hesitant, as if it too was debating its journey. The approaching gloom set her teeth on edge, but she forced herself to shake it off. It was ridiculous, she told herself. It was just a camping trip. She clutched the straps of her bag tighter, breathing out slowly. After all, wasn't this exactly the kind of adventure they all wanted? One last story to tell before college separated them all. "Come on, Claire, don't look so terrified," Ryan called, waving her over with a wide, toothy grin. His enthusiasm was unwavering, bright as ever. He stood at the edge of the wooded path, his usual swagger even bolder as he gestured to the rest of the group. "We're not even there yet, and you're looking like you saw a ghost," Jess snorted, nudging Claire with a smirk. "She's just worried about all those spooky stories the locals spin about the swamp," she said, clearly amused. "Right, Claire?" "Ha-ha," Claire muttered, rolling her eyes, trying to play it off. "I'm not worried about ghost stories. I just think it's, maybe a little reckless to camp in the middle of a swamp, in the dark, with no cell service." Jess waved a dismissive hand. "Please, we'll be fine. It's just an island. People make up those stories to keep kids from doing stupid stuff out there." She threw Ryan a mockingly serious look, which obviously is exactly why Ryan wants to go. "Exactly," Ryan laughed, unbothered by her jab. "Nothing like facing down some tall tales to kick off the summer. I mean, come on, what's a little creepy swamp? We're practically adults now." Behind them, Marcus trailed with a hesitant shuffle, his eyes darting toward the darkening sky. He looked out of place, his anxiety written in every line of his posture. "I don't know, guys," he murmured, a hint of worry tightening his voice. "Maybe Claire's right, if it rains." Ryan gave him a playful shove, laughing. "You worry too much, Marcus. Where's your sense of adventure? Besides, the island's supposed to be perfectly safe, right? Just a few spooky trees, some swamp water, and bam, you've got yourself a ghost story." "Easy for you to say," Marcus muttered. It's not you who's going to freak out at every strange sound. We'll all freak out a little," Jess said dryly. "And that's kind of the point." With some reluctance, Claire felt her worries ease as the familiar banter rose around her, lightening the mood. They were just stories, nothing real. She had spent her entire life in this town and never seen anything more frightening than a stray fox in the woods. What could a few trees and shadows really do? They walked deeper into the woods, the trail growing narrower and slicker as they drew closer to the swamp. The heavy silence settled in, broken only by the squelch of wet earth under their boots and the occasional murmur of a bird or croak of a frog hidden in the underbrush. Somewhere along the way, Claire felt that faint thread of anxiety tugging at her again, the feeling of being watched. She brushed it off as nerves, clinging to Jess's steady commentary on everything from the outrageously muddy trail to Ryan's questionable choice in camping gear. After a short but treacherous hike, they finally reached the edge of the swamp. The water stretched out before them, still and opaque, tinged with shades of green and gray that seemed almost otherworldly. The air felt different here, heavier with a strange, earthy smell that clung to them, a mix of moss, rot, and stagnant water. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen," Ryan announced with a dramatic flair, "to the legendary Isle of the Swamp Watcher." Jess chuckled, snapping a quick picture on her phone. "I bet that island's as normal as anything. I'll be disappointed if I don't at least get one creepy swamp monster sighting tonight." Claire chuckled weakly, masking her unease. The swamp looked endless, a maze of tangled roots and twisted trees barely visible beyond the thickening fog. It was strange. She had seen this swamp before, even crossed it once or twice in daylight. But tonight, as they prepared to embark, it seemed different, as if it had somehow grown darker and deeper, a vast stretch of unknowable depths beyond the water's edge. Marcus looked at Claire, his voice a nervous whisper. "I know we're just doing this for fun, but you ever wonder if there's a reason people stay away from that island?" Before Claire could answer, Ryan clapped Marcus on the back with a grin. "Come on, don't chicken out now. Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" They climbed into the small, weather-beaten boat Ryan had borrowed from a local friend, a rickety thing that groaned and creaked as they loaded it with their bags. Ryan and Jess took up the paddles, and with a few awkward pulls, they launched off into the water. The fog parted slowly, just enough to guide them along the path as they paddled toward the island. The island loomed closer, its trees rising tall and strange, twisting branches reaching out like dark skeletal fingers. The silence was all-consuming. Even the frogs and insects seemed to quiet as they approached. Claire couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back, watching from the darkness. As they neared the shore, Jess broke the silence with a low whistle. "Okay, I'll admit, it's a bit creepy." She laughed, but her voice held a nervous edge. "Looks like we've arrived at the land of ghosts." Ryan was the first to jump out of the boat, his shoes sinking slightly into the muck as he helped Jess and Marcus onto the shore. "Ghosts or not, this is going to be great," he said, setting his bag down with exaggerated confidence. "We'll set up camp, tell some spooky stories, and survive the night just fine." Claire hesitated for a moment, watching her friends as they unpacked, feeling the oppressive quiet settle around them. A few steps from the water's edge, the twisted trees seemed to thicken, pressing close like sentries guarding the island's secrets. She caught her reflection in the water, murky and indistinct, her face almost foreign in the rippling darkness. "Just nerves," she told herself again, tearing her gaze away. The four friends began setting up camp, their voices low and careful, as if they were afraid to disturb something hidden in the shadows. The trees overhead cast a strange light through their thick branches, the last streaks of twilight fading into deep purples and grays. Somewhere in the distance, a soft splash broke the silence, faded into stillness. Claire's stomach twisted as she took in their surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding, that this was a place where no one was meant to stay. Yet they were here now, and there was no turning back. Night settled over the island with a weight that seemed to press down on their camp, thick and suffocating. The trees overhead created a twisted canopy, blotting out the faint moonlight that tried to pierce through. The only light came from their small, sputtering campfire, flickering weakly as though even the flames were hesitant to grow in this place. Ryan poked at the fire, coaxing it to burn brighter. "All right, who's ready for some ghost stories?" he asked, grinning as he looked around at his friends. He seemed almost energized by the dark, as if he was thriving in the tension hanging over them. Jess rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress a smile. "Come on, we don't need ghost stories. The place itself is already creepy enough." "Exactly why we need ghost stories," Ryan said with a wink. He leaned forward, his face lit by the firelight, casting shadows that twisted his grin into something unsettling. "We're out here to face our fears, right?" "Some of us are," Claire murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She forced a small smile to show she was joking, but her stomach churned as she looked around the campsite. The trees felt closer, as if they were watching, listening. Ryan raised an eyebrow, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Oh, come on, Claire, don't tell me you're actually scared." Claire shrugged, trying to act casual. "Not scared, just cautious. There's a difference." Beside her, Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the edge of the camp. "I think she's right. This place doesn't exactly feel welcoming, you know?" "Oh, come on, you two," Jess scoffed. "It's just an island. If we're going to let a couple of creepy trees and some mud scare us, we might as well pack up and go home." Ryan shook his head. "No way. We're here for the night. Let's make the most of it." He cleared his throat, leaning in as he began his story. "So, there's this legend. Don't roll your eyes, Jess. Just hear me out. The Swamp Watcher, they call it." "Oh, here we go," Jess muttered, crossing her arms, but her eyes didn't leave Ryan as he spoke. "They say the Swamp Watcher is some kind of spirit or entity who guards this place." Ryan continued, his voice low, drawing them in. "It's been here as long as anyone can remember, maybe even longer than the swamp itself. According to the locals, it watches everyone who enters its territory, deciding whether they're worthy to leave." Claire shivered as Ryan's words sank in. She glanced around, half expecting to see eyes gleaming in the shadows. "How would it decide if we're worthy?" Ryan leaned back, smiling darkly. "No one really knows. Some say it tests people's courage. Others think it's just hungry for anyone foolish enough to step foot on its island. Whatever it is, the few people who came back from here said they felt it watching, waiting, and that it could read their thoughts, sense their fears. Jess snorted, though the sound came out forced. So, what, it's some kind of fear-eating monster? Maybe, Ryan replied with a shrug, the firelight casting strange shadows over his face. Maybe it's something worse. A thick silence followed his words, the weight of his story settling over them. Even Jess seemed momentarily at a loss for words, her usual confidence muted as she glanced around the camp. Claire felt her heart beating faster, her skin prickling with unease. She knew it was just a story, just Ryan's way of getting a rise out of them. But as she looked into the darkness beyond the fire's glow, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifted through the air, like the rustling of leaves, but slower, more deliberate. Claire froze, listening, her breath caught in her throat. "Did anyone hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The others looked at her, their expressions a mix of confusion and annoyance. "Hear what?" Jess asked, raising an eyebrow. Claire hesitated, feeling foolish. I thought I heard something. Like a whisper." Ryan grinned, clearly delighted. "See? The Swamp Watcher's already getting to you!" "Shut up, Ryan," she muttered, hugging her knees to her chest as she turned her gaze back to the fire. But as she stared into the flames, the sound came again, a soft, distant murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She looked up sharply, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. Marcus shifted nervously, his eyes wide as he looked around. "I think I heard it too. Something. Just out there." He pointed a shaky finger toward the edge of the trees, where the shadows thickened into an impenetrable wall. Jess rolled her eyes, but her face had paled. "You two are just letting Ryan's story get in your heads. It's nothing." But even as she spoke, a strange sound broke through the night. A faint splash from somewhere beyond the trees, followed by a low, croaking sound that echoed through the stillness. The noise was guttural, almost human, and it sent a chill up Claire's spine. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan chuckled, though his laughter sounded hollow. "Probably just a frog or something. This is a swamp, after all." "No," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with fear. That didn't sound like any frog I've ever heard." Another splash, closer this time, as if something was wading through the water, coming closer to the camp. The friends huddled together instinctively, each one feeling the creeping dread settle over them. The sound faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. "Maybe we should turn in for the night," Jess suggested, her voice strained. "The sooner we sleep, the sooner we can leave in the morning." The others nodded, each relieved to have an excuse to retreat into the safety of their tents. Claire crawled into hers, zipping it up quickly and burying herself in her sleeping bag. The thin material of the tent did little to make her feel safe, but she told herself it was enough, that it would block out the strange sounds, the shadows that seemed to press closer every time she looked outside. The night dragged on, each passing second stretching into what felt like hours. Claire tried to sleep, closing her eyes tightly, but every rustle of the trees, every distant splash, kept her on edge. Her mind raced, conjuring images of dark figures lurking just outside her tent, waiting. And then she heard it, a soft, gentle whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Claire." Her blood turned to ice as she recognized her own name, drifting through the darkness like a breath. She clutched her sleeping bag, squeezing her eyes shut, hoping it was her imagination. "Claire." The voice came again, low and melodic, drifting through the night air with an eerie calm. She knew she should ignore it, pretend she hadn't heard, but some part of her was compelled, drawn to the sound. Slowly, reluctantly, she unzipped her tent just a crack, peering out into the shadows. Nothing. Only the dark outline of trees and the faint glow of dying embers from their campfire. She took a shaky breath, telling herself it was just the wind. But as she began to zip her tent back up, she caught a glimpse of movement, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light of the fire. It was tall and thin, almost human in shape, but its features were obscured by shadow, its outline barely visible against the darkness. Her breath caught, her heart pounding as she watched the figure. It didn't move, didn't speak, but somehow she knew it was looking right at her, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Suddenly the figure tilted its head as though considering her, before fading into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on her with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Claire ducked back into her tent, zipping it up all the way and curling into a tight ball, her heart racing as she replayed the image over and over in her mind. She wanted to tell herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Sleep was out of the question now. She lay awake, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, her ears straining for any sound, any sign of the figure returning. But the night remained silent, thick with the unspoken promise of something lurking, waiting in the darkness. When dawn finally broke, the island looked different in the early light. The twisted trees were less menacing, their gnarled limbs softened in the warm glow, and the murky water of the swamp sparkled faintly in the distance. Yet, as Claire crawled out of her tent, she felt no relief. The strange events of the night still clung to her mind like a thick fog. She wasn't the only one who looked shaken. Jess was unusually quiet, her face pale as she stirred the embers of the campfire. Ryan, who was normally the loudest and most confident among them, sat cross-legged, his eyes distant, as though lost in thought. Marcus emerged last, his face drawn and tired, dark circles under his eyes. "Did anyone else hear things last night?" Claire asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. Jess looked up sharply, her expression a mix of irritation and unease. "You too?" she muttered. "I kept hearing breathing, like someone was right outside my tent. I told myself it was just one of you messing around, but—" She trailed off, shivering slightly. Ryan glanced at her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I heard something too. Thought I saw something by the trees." He forced a grin, trying to brush it off. "It was probably just an animal, or maybe my mind playing tricks. This place just has a creepy vibe." Marcus spoke next, his voice barely a whisper. "I felt someone touch my shoulder. I thought it was one of you guys, but when I looked—" He shuddered, not finishing his sentence. Claire felt a chill run through her, her own memory of the figure at the edge of the clearing flashing back vividly. But she kept quiet about it, afraid of sounding crazy. "So it wasn't just me. Great." She managed a small, humorless laugh, her nerves frayed. Ryan clapped his hands, forcing some energy into his voice. "Look, we just psyched ourselves out. It's a spooky place. Yeah, but it's all in our heads. Just a bunch of local legends and creepy trees." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as the others. "I say we make breakfast, hang out for a while, and head back once we're all packed up." They agreed reluctantly, though the unspoken unease lingered as they pulled out granola bars and cold sandwiches. Each of them stayed close to the fire, as though its warmth could shield them from the strange presence they felt around them. They ate in silence, their eyes darting occasionally toward the trees. After breakfast, Ryan stood and stretched. "All right, let's pack up and head back." He tried to sound upbeat, but his forced cheeriness only highlighted the tension hanging in the air. But as they began to pack, Jess froze, looking around in confusion. "Where's the boat?" she asked, her voice laced with panic. The others turned, realizing with a sickening jolt that their boat, tied securely to a tree by the shore the night before, was gone. Only a broken piece of rope dangled from the tree, frayed as if it had been snapped with incredible force. "What the hell?" Ryan murmured, running a hand through his hair, his confident demeanor slipping. "It was right here. There's no way it just drifted off. I tied it myself." Claire's heart sank as she stared at the empty space where their boat had been. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find a logical explanation, but each thought brought her back to the same chilling possibility, that they were no longer alone on the island. "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear. Ryan hesitated, clearly rattled. "There has to be something we can use to get back. Maybe we can find materials to make a raft, or something." He didn't sound convinced, and the others exchanged uncertain glances. As they began searching the shore for anything that could help them, Claire's sense of unease grew stronger. The swamp seemed different, like it was watching them, its silence thick and heavy, pressing down on them. Each step felt harder, as if the ground itself was reluctant to let them leave. They found nothing along the shoreline but mud and roots, a seemingly endless stretch of murky water that separated them from the safety of the mainland. Even the air felt thicker, clogging their throats with each breath. "We can't stay here," Jess said, her voice a little frantic. "We have to find some way to get back, or at least signal for help." "Yeah, because we'll just flag down the nearest search party." Ryan snapped, his nerves finally showing. "We're miles from anyone. We'd be lucky if anyone even knows we're here." An uncomfortable silence followed as each of them grappled with the grim reality. They were stranded on a haunted island, surrounded by miles of swamp, with no boat and no way to call for help. Even Jess's usual skepticism seemed to waver as she looked out over the endless water. "Maybe if we stick together, we'll be okay," Marcus said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Claire bit her lip, a cold weight settling in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that the island had lured them here, trapping them for some twisted purpose. The shadows seemed thicker, more alive, as though the very air was waiting, watching. As they regrouped by the campfire, the wind picked up, carrying a faint, unmistakable sound through the trees, a low, croaking murmur, almost like a laugh. It was deep and guttural, echoing in a way that made Claire's skin crawl. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, glancing around. Her friends nodded, their faces pale, eyes wide as they scanned the trees. Then the croaking came again, louder this time, punctuated by a splash that seemed closer than before. The sound moved slowly, as though something was wading through the swamp, each step accompanied by that unsettling, raspy noise. It's just an animal," Jess said, her voice trembling as she gripped her backpack. But as they stood, rooted to spot, a figure appeared at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, draped in shadow, barely discernible in the dim light. Its form was hunched, its limbs long and misshapen, as though made of twisted roots and swamp muck. The creature didn't move closer, but its gaze was fixed on them, two pinpoints of pale light where eyes should have been, watching intently. Claire felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding painfully as she stared at the thing. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a figure made of darkness and decay, blending seamlessly with the swamp. The others seemed equally transfixed, caught in the creature's cold, unblinking gaze. Is that?" Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. "The Watcher," Ryan whispered, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered terror. As if responding to its name, the creature tilted its head, a slow, almost curious motion. It stood there for a long moment, silent and still, before vanishing into the shadows, melting back into the trees as though it had never been there. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke, each of them trapped in their own spiraling thoughts. What do we do?" Jess finally managed, her voice breaking. She looked around, her face a mask of fear and disbelief. "Are we just supposed to sit here and wait for it to come back?" Ryan shook his head, his hands trembling. "No, we're getting off this island one way or another. We'll build a raft or find something that floats." He paused, looking over his friends, his voice low. "But we need to stick together. If we split up, we're as good as dead." The others nodded, though the fear in their eyes betrayed their doubts. They began scavenging the campsite for anything that could help them, tree branches, vines, even pieces of their tents. The island seemed determined to keep them, every step in the mud feeling like it was sinking deeper, as if it wanted to pull them under. As they worked, the shadows grew darker, closing in around them. The swamp seemed to stretch on endlessly, each sound amplified, every splash or whisper sending a jolt of fear through their bodies. Finally, after what felt like hours, they had assembled a crude raft made from branches and vines, barely enough to hold them. It was rickety and unsteady, but it was their only chance. They dragged it to the edge of the water, their movements frantic, glancing over their shoulders at the shadows that seemed to pulse with life. As they prepared to launch, Claire felt a shiver crawl up her spine, a sensation that they were being watched. Turning, she caught a glimpse of the Watcher's eyes glowing faintly in the distance, barely visible through the dense foliage. She could feel its gaze on her, intense and unblinking, as though marking her for something inevitable. With a trembling breath, she forced herself to look away, gripping the edge of the raft as they pushed it into the water. The swamp rippled around them, thick and dark, resisting their movement as though trying to pull them back. As they drifted slowly away from the shore, the Watcher's faint croak echoed through the trees, a low, sinister sound that followed them into the water. The raft creaked and groaned beneath them, barely holding their weight as they pushed off from the shore. Claire sat at the edge, her knees drawn to her chest, trying to keep herself as still as possible to avoid putting any more strain on their fragile craft. The others sat similarly tense, eyes darting between the murky water and the looming shadows of the swamp. The island receded behind them, swallowed quickly by the dense mist that clung to the water, but as they drifted farther, Claire felt no relief. The swamp stretched out in all directions, each expanse of water looking identical to the last, twisting and shifting in ways that made her stomach turn. It felt like they were moving in circles, like the swamp itself was pulling them back, guiding them deeper into its grasp. "Are we sure we're going the right way?" Jess asked, her voice shaky. She squinted through the fog, but every direction seemed to lead to more mist, more tangled trees, and endless darkness. "We're going somewhere," Ryan muttered, his voice betraying his own uncertainty. He paddled with a long, gnarled branch they had salvaged from the shore, each stroke pushing them forward through the viscous water. But his movements were slow, labored, and the raft barely seemed to move. Marcus hugged himself, his face ashen. "We're lost, aren't we? It feels like we're not getting anywhere." "No," Ryan snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "We just need to keep moving. There's got to be a way out." As they drifted, a strange silence settled over them, thick and unnatural. The usual sounds of the swamp, croaks, splashes, and rustling leaves, had vanished, leaving only the soft lapping of water against their makeshift raft. Even the fog seemed to press closer, wrapping around them like a living thing. Claire found herself straining to hear anything that would break the silence, but there was nothing. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that somewhere, just beyond the mist, something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. A soft splash broke the silence, causing everyone to tense. The sound was close, too close, as if something had slipped into the water right beside them. Claire's heart pounded, her eyes scanning the dark water, but she saw nothing, only the faint ripples spreading outward from the raft. "It's nothing," Ryan said, though his voice sounded forced, strained, just something in the water. Another splash, this one louder, and Jess gasped, grabbing Marcus's arm. "That's not nothing, Ryan. Something's out there." As if to confirm her fears, a dark shape glided beneath the surface, visible for only a moment before disappearing. Claire's breath hitched as she caught sight of it, a long, sinuous form moving with unnatural grace just below the water's surface. What is that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan gripped the paddle tighter, his eyes darting around as he tried to keep calm. Probably a fish, a big fish. But Claire knew it wasn't a fish. The shape had been too long, too large, and there was something about its movement that felt wrong, almost calculated, like it was studying them, assessing. The raft drifted on, the silence growing heavier, and Claire felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. She dared to look over the edge, peering into the murky depths. For a moment, she thought she saw a face, a pale, gaunt visage staring up at her, its eyes wide and lifeless. She jerked back, her heart racing, but when she looked again, it was gone, replaced by only darkness and murky water. "Don't look into the water," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something down there." Jess shot her a terrified glance. "What do you mean, something?" Claire shook her head, unable to explain the sight she had just seen, the face that seemed to drift just beneath the surface, waiting. "Just trust me, don't look down." Ryan continued paddling, though his movements were now frantic, as if he too felt the presence surrounding them, tightening around their fragile raft. His arms shook as he struggled against the swamp's resistance, but it was as if the water itself was pushing them back, pulling them closer to the island. "We're not getting anywhere," he finally muttered, his voice breaking. "I don't understand. It feels like we're moving, but we're not." "It's the swamp," Jess whispered, her voice filled with a kind of fearful awe. "It doesn't want us to leave." Marcus began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as panic set in. No, this can't be happening. We have to get out of here." In his desperation, he scrambled to the edge of the raft, leaning forward as though he might swim, but as he looked into the water, his face twisted in horror. He let out a strangled cry, stumbling back and nearly capsizing the raft. "Marcus!" Claire reached out, grabbing his arm to steady him. "What did you see?" He shook his head violently, his eyes wide and wild. Faces, in the water, dead faces, staring at me. Claire felt a shiver run through her. She knew what he had seen. She had glimpsed it too. The realization washed over her, chilling her to the bone. The swamp was filled with the lost souls of those who had come before, trapped forever beneath the surface, watching and waiting. The mist thickened, curling around them, obscuring the swamp in every direction. Ryan's face was pale, his hands trembling as he held the paddle. Jess huddled closer to Claire, her earlier skepticism erased by the fear that now gripped her. Then, out of the silence, came the whisper, a low, guttural voice that echoed through the mist, soft and taunting. "Come back!" The words were barely more than a breath, but they carried through the fog, reaching each of them. It was the same voice Claire had heard the night before, but this time unmistakable, resonant with a malice that sent shivers down her spine. Did you all hear that?" Jess asked, her voice breaking. They nodded, each too terrified to speak, each feeling the words settle over them like a curse. "Come back!" The voice repeated, louder this time, filled with an almost playful cruelty. The water around the raft began to ripple, gentle at first, then more forceful, as though something below the surface was moving, circling them. Ryan's face twisted with determination, his grip tightening on the paddle. "No, we're not going back," he whispered, as if speaking directly to the voice, defying it. But the swamp seemed to laugh, a chorus of faint whispers rising around them, each voice overlapping, echoing, growing louder until the air buzzed with the sound. Faces appeared in the mist, faint and ghostly, barely visible but undeniably there, pale and sorrowful, eyes hollow, staring as they drifted closer to the raft. "Come back," the voices chanted, the words blending together, growing louder with each repetition. Marcus whimpered, covering his ears, his face contorted in fear. "Make it stop. Make it stop." The voices grew louder, an unbearable cacophony that seemed to seep into their very bones, each word laced with despair and anger, with the weight of centuries of lost souls. The raft began to rock, the water churning around them, as if the swamp itself was rising to swallow them whole. In a desperate attempt to silence the voices, Claire closed her eyes, clutching her knees to her chest, trying to block out the sound. But the voices seemed to fill her mind, echoing in the deepest parts of her consciousness, whispering, demanding, drawing her closer to the edge. Finally, in a single deafening roar, the voices rose as one. "Come back!" The water surged, and the raft lurched violently, throwing them all to their knees. Claire opened her eyes just in time to see a figure rising from the water, its body twisted and covered in dark, dripping muck. It was the Swamp Watcher, the entity from the night before, but now its form was clearer, more defined, a grotesque blend of human and swamp, its limbs knotted with roots, its face a hollow mask of decayed flesh and murky sludge. Its eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence as it reached out a skeletal, root-covered hand toward them, fingers dripping with algae and mud. The stench was overpowering, a sickening mix of rotten decay that burned their noses, made their eyes water. "Leave us alone," Ryan shouted, lifting the paddle as if to strike the creature. The Watcher tilted its head, a twisted grin forming on its hollow face, as if amused by his defiance. With one fluid movement, it raised its hand, and the water around the raft surged, swirling in a violent whirlpool, pulling them toward its grasp. Claire clung to the raft, her fingers digging into the wood, her mind screaming in terror. The swamp closed in around them, suffocating, pulling them down, dragging them deeper and deeper. In the midst of the chaos, Claire's eyes met the Watcher's, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she felt it probing her mind, peering into her deepest fears, her darkest memories. It knew her every weakness, every fear she had tried to bury. The Watcher's hollow gaze bore into her, stripping away her defenses, exposing her vulnerabilities, as though it was feeding on them, drawing strength from her terror. With a surge of instinctive courage, Claire ripped her gaze away from the Watcher, focusing instead on her friends, her hands gripping the edge of the raft. "Stay together," she shouted, her voice hoarse, barely rising above the roar of the swirling water. "Don't let it separate us." Ryan, Jess, and Marcus locked eyes with her, each nodding through the panic, their faces pale but determined. Their hands gripped the edges of the raft, knuckles white, and Claire could feel their resolve mirroring her own, a collective surge of defiance that pushed back, if only slightly, against the Watcher's consuming presence. The whirlpool intensified, the water pulling and tugging with brutal force, dragging the raft closer to the creature's outstretched hand. The faces of the lost souls in the water below seemed to cry out, their silent pleas echoing in Claire's mind, each one a reminder of those who hadn't made it, who had fallen to the swamp's eternal grasp. Just as the water's force seemed on the brink of ripping them apart, the swamp's fog began to part, if only faintly. Through the mist, Claire caught a fleeting glimpse of solid ground, a strip of land barely visible, obscured by the swamp's shifting, ghostly veil. "Land! There!" she shouted, her voice filled with a desperate hope as she pointed toward the glimmer of salvation. "We have to make it there!" Without hesitation, Ryan shifted his grip on the paddle, digging into the water with every ounce of strength he had left. Jess and Marcus scrambled to help, scooping handfuls of water to propel them forward, every muscle straining as they fought the water's unrelenting pull. The Watcher let out a low, guttural roar, its skeletal arms swiping through the mist, its fingers clawing at them as though it could sense their escape. Claire could feel its rage vibrating through the air, the swamp itself seeming to pulse with its fury, the fog thickening, curling around them, trying to obscure their path. But they pressed forward, pushing against the current, their eyes locked on that narrow sliver of land ahead. With a final heave, the raft broke free of the whirlpool's grip, propelled forward by sheer will and desperation. They drifted closer, each inch feeling like a victory, until the raft scraped against the muddy shore, coming to an abrupt, jarring halt. They didn't waste a second. One by one, they leaped from the raft onto solid ground, stumbling and collapsing in the mud, gasping for breath. The fog swirled around them, lot closing in like a shroud, but they had made it. They were free, if only for the moment. Behind them, the Swamp Watcher's figure faded into the mist, its hollow gaze lingering on them, a dark, resentful presence that seemed to pulse with quiet, seething rage. Claire could feel its fury like a cold wind, a promise that it would not let them go so easily. But she pushed the thought aside, scrambling to her feet, pulling her friends up with her. They had escaped, they had defied the swamp, if only temporarily, and as she looked into her friends' eyes, she could see the same resolve burning in each of them. "We keep moving," Claire said, her voice trembling but fierce. "As long as we don't stop, as long as we stay together, it can't have us." They nodded, each one gripping her hand in solidarity, and together they turned away from the swamp's grasp, their steps uncertain but steady as they forged a path through the mist, leaving the Swamp Watcher's furious gaze behind. The world was dark. Claire's senses were muffled, as though she were trapped underwater, only dim impressions filtering through. A murky vision here, a faint voice there, disjointed and incomprehensible. When she opened her eyes, she was lying alone on the damp ground, the raft gone, her friends nowhere in sight. The swamp loomed around her, shrouded in mist and silence, thick with a pulsing darkness that seemed to breathe with her. A distant, echoing call broke the silence, like the faint hum of a voice just beyond reach. She staggered to her feet, her legs shaking as she took in her surroundings. Trees twisted and bent overhead, their branches like skeletal hands stretched toward her. The fog pressed against her skin, cool and damp, and she could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes following her movements. "Ryan? Jess? Marcus?" she called, her voice trembling, the words swallowed by the mist. Silence. The swamp had shifted around her, closing in with unfamiliar trees and dark pools of water that hadn't been there before. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Claire hugged herself, trying to calm her racing heart, but the terror clawed at her from within, as if the swamp itself was inside her, sinking its roots into her mind. And then she heard it. The whisper again, a low, insistent murmur that seemed to echo from all directions. "Come, back." She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the swamp, dark and endless, stretching on forever. A growing dread filled her as she realized she wasn't just lost. She was trapped, caught in a place that defied reality, twisting around her like a nightmare. In the distance, a faint glow appeared, flickering between the trees like the dying embers of a campfire. Claire's heart leapt. Maybe her friends were there. Maybe they'd all just gotten separated. She started toward the light, her feet dragging through the mud, the whispers growing louder with each step. The glow pulsed, growing stronger as she approached, until she could make out the shape of figures huddled around the fire. Relief washed over her. She quickened her pace, her voice breaking as she called out, "Ryan! Jess! Marcus!" But as she neared the light, her steps faltered. The figures around the fire didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. She squinted, her heart hammering as she took in their forms. They weren't her friends. 3 people sat around the fire, their bodies still, heads bowed. Their clothes were tattered, stained with mud, their skin pale and gaunt. They looked like ghosts, their hollow faces cast in an eerie light. Claire stepped back, a wave of nausea rising within her as one of the figures slowly lifted its head. Its eyes were empty, lifeless, the sockets dark and sunken. The mouth opened, an unnatural, gaping hole, and from it came a low, guttural croak that echoed through the trees. "Come, back!" Claire stumbled, terror seizing her as the other figures turned toward her, their empty eyes staring, their mouths forming the same haunting whisper. She backed away, her breaths coming in sharp, panic gasps as the figures began to rise, moving toward her with a slow, deliberate purpose. "No, stay away," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figures didn't stop, their faces twisted in grotesque, mournful expressions, their mouths forming words that no longer made sense, each one garbled and broken, like the remnants of a long-lost language. Claire turned and ran. She bolted through the trees, her feet slipping on the wet ground, her heart pounding as the whispers followed her, growing louder, more desperate. She could hear their footsteps now, soft and shuffling, as though they were struggling to keep up with her. But the voices, they were inside her mind, filling her thoughts with the relentless call to return, to give in. Come back. Come back. Finally, her legs gave out and she collapsed beside a large tree, pressing her back against its rough bark as she tried to catch her breath. Her entire body trembled, her pulse racing as she stared into the darkness, waiting, dreading the moment those hollow faces would appear. But there was nothing. The swamp had fallen silent again, the whispers gone, leaving only the steady thrum of her heartbeat filling the emptiness. For a moment, she let herself believe that maybe she was alone, that the figures were just an illusion, a trick of her panicked mind. But as her heartbeat slowed, she became aware of something else, something far more sinister. A chill crept over her skin as she sensed it, a presence, close and quiet, waiting in the shadows just beyond the edge of her vision. Slowly, she turned her head, and there, standing in the murky half-light, was the Swamp Watcher. Its form was clearer now, more defined, a tall, gaunt figure, draped in rotting moss and twisted roots. Its eyes gleamed with a pale, unnatural light, watching her with an intensity that sent ice through her veins. The Watcher tilted its head, its gaze unblinking, as if studying her, measuring her worth. Claire couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was trapped, frozen beneath its gaze, as if the swamp itself was holding her in place. And then, without a sound, the Watcher began to move, gliding toward her with a slow, deliberate grace. Each step was silent, the ground undisturbed, as though it floated just above the earth. "Please," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." But the Watcher only moved closer, its hollow eyes locked onto her, unwavering. She felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on her, sinking into her thoughts, her memories, pulling her deeper into the darkness. As it drew near, Claire felt a cold hand wrap around her mind, prying open her thoughts, filling her with images, visions of the swamp, dark and endless, filled with the lost souls who had come before her, each one trapped, bound to this place, their faces twisted in eternal despair. She could feel their pain, their fear, their hopelessness, all of it merging with her own, binding her to the swamp with invisible threads. "No, no, this isn't real," she whispered, trying to fight the pull. "This can't be real." The Watcher's face twisted into a grotesque smile, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it leaned in close, its cold breath ghosting over her skin as it whispered in a voice that was both ancient and endless. "It is real, and you are mine." With a final, desperate surge of strength, Claire tore herself away from the tree, stumbling backward, away from the Watcher. She didn't look back, didn't dare see if it was following, only focused on putting as much distance between herself and the creature as possible. She ran, her feet pounding against the soft earth, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The swamp seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of twisted trees and thick, unyielding mud, pulling her deeper with each step. Finally, just as she felt her strength give out, she broke through the trees and stumbled into a small clearing. And there, huddled near a faint, smoldering fire, were her friends, Ryan, Jess, and Marcus, each one looking as lost and terrified as she felt. "Claire!" Jess cried, running to her and pulling her into a tight hug. We thought you were gone." Claire clung to her, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face as the weight of everything she'd seen crashed over her. Ryan and Marcus gathered around, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. "We tried to follow you, but the swamp kept shifting," Ryan said, his voice hollow. "It was like it wanted to keep us apart." Claire nodded, wiping her tears. "It's not just a swamp," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's something here. It doesn't want us to leave." They sat in silence, each one grappling with the horror of their situation, the growing realization that they were trapped, bound to a place that was neither alive nor dead. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely audible. "So, what do we do now?" The words hung in the air, heavy and final. There was no easy answer, no quick escape. The swamp had drawn them in, lured them with whispers and shadows, and now it held them, feeding on their fear, their despair. Claire took a deep breath, her mind racing, searching for any sliver of hope. "We can't give in," she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. "We have to keep moving, together." The others nodded, though their eyes betrayed their doubts, their fear. But there was no other choice. They were bound by something far more powerful than themselves, something ancient and relentless. And as they huddled together in the dim light of the fire, the swamp around them pulsed with a quiet, hungry anticipation, watching, waiting for them to make their next move. The swamp closed in tighter as they made their way through the dense trees, each step squelching in the mud, every movement shadowed by the thick fog that seemed to follow them. The faint light from their campfire had faded behind them, leaving only the damp, suffocating darkness of the swamp, pressing close as if it were alive. Ryan took the lead, wielding a thick branch he'd broken from a tree, though he moved with the nervous stiffness of someone who knew it wouldn't do any good. Jess followed close behind him, her expression tense, while Marcus and Claire brought up the rear, glancing over their shoulders every few seconds, as though expecting to see the swamp watcher materialize from the shadows. "Where are we even going?" Marcus whispered, his voice a fearful rasp. "This whole place feels like it's looping back on itself." "Anywhere but here," Ryan replied, his voice barely audible. "As long as we keep moving, we have a chance. Maybe if we follow the shoreline, we can find a way back." Jess sighed, her voice cracking. "We tried that already. Everything just shifts around us. It's like the swamp is alive, like it's toying with us." Claire placed a hand on Jess's shoulder, trying to reassure her, though her own hands were shaking. "We just need to stay together. Whatever's here, it can't be everywhere at once. If we don't give in, we have a chance. We just have to keep going." They trudged on, their footsteps heavy with exhaustion, but the relentless dread kept them moving. The whispers came and went, faint voices that slithered through the fog, just on the edge of hearing. Sometimes they seemed to call specific names, Ryan, Jess, Marcus, Claire, drawing them deeper, luring them away from each other with promises and lies. And with every step, Claire could feel the swamp tightening its hold, its shadows pressing closer, each one thicker and darker than the last. After what felt like hours, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the faint outline of something solid up ahead, a half-rotted wooden structure, barely visible through the mist. It stood alone, crooked and decaying, a forgotten relic in the middle of the swamp. "What is that?" Jess murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Ryan moved forward, his footsteps slowing as he approached the structure. "Looks like a cabin. How could there be a cabin out here?" "Maybe someone used to live here," Marcus suggested, though his voice was laced with doubt. "Or maybe someone still does." They hesitated, each one eyeing the cabin with a mixture of hope and dread. It looked as though it could collapse at any moment, its walls slanted and buckling, the wood dark and soaked through with years of rot and mold. But it was a break in the endless expanse of trees and water, a potential refuge, however temporary. "We should check it out," Claire said, though every instinct in her body screamed at her to stay away. If there's anything inside, supplies, maybe even a map, it could help us get out of here. Ryan nodded, pushing down his own hesitation. All right, let's stay close and watch each other's backs. They approached the cabin cautiously, each step seeming to echo through the silence. The air grew colder as they neared the door, the faint smell of decay seeping from within, mingling with the earthy stench of the swamp. Ryan reached for the door, his hand hovering for a moment before he steeled himself and pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, the cabin was small and dark, the faint glow of the fog providing the only illumination. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling with every movement, and cobwebs draped across the ceiling and walls. The floor was littered with remnants of old furniture, an overturned chair, a shattered table, and what looked like the tattered remains of a bed. Who would live out here? Jess whispered, her eyes scanning the decaying room with a mixture of disgust and pity. No one, Claire replied softly. Not anymore. As they stepped inside, a strange feeling settled over Claire, a heavy weight that pressed down on her, filling her with a sense of unease. It was as if the cabin itself was watching, waiting, just like the swamp. Ryan moved toward a small cabinet on the far wall, gingerly opening it to reveal a scattering of rusted tins and broken glass. Nothing useful, he muttered, pushing it shut with a sigh. Claire wandered toward a corner of the cabin, her gaze falling on a small, water-stained journal lying half-hidden beneath a layer of dust. She knelt down, wiping the grime away, and carefully opened the fragile pages. The handwriting was faded, barely legible, but she could make out a few lines, scrawled hastily, filled with a desperate energy. The Watcher is real. It waits in the shadows, feeding on the lost and the broken. No one escapes its gaze. I have tried. The rest of the words were smudged, the ink bleeding into the paper, but Claire felt a cold chill wash over her. Whoever had written this had been trapped here, just like them, fighting a losing battle against the same presence that now hunted them. Look at this, she whispered, holding the journal out to her friends. They gathered around, reading the words in silence, the fear evident on each of their faces. Someone else was here, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling, and they didn't make it. Maybe they were alone, Ryan said, though his voice lacked conviction. We're together. That has to make a difference. But even as he spoke, Claire felt a sense of dread settle over her. The journal's words lingered in her mind, a grim reminder of the fate that awaited them if they didn't find a way out. Suddenly, a loud, hollow knock echoed from the far side of the cabin, reverberating through the decaying walls. The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone or something tapping insistently. They froze, each of them glancing at the others, fear stark in their eyes. Did anyone else hear that? Jess whispered, clutching Claire's arm. Ryan nodded, his face pale. Yeah, and I don't think we're alone. Another knock, louder this time, resonated through the cabin, followed by a soft, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. Marcus let out a shuddering breath. We need to leave, now. Claire's gaze darted toward the door, but she stopped short as she noticed a shadow moving outside the cabin, faint but unmistakable. The Swamp Watcher was there, lurking just beyond the thin walls, waiting. Her heart hammered in her chest as the scraping grew louder, more insistent, each sound sending chills down her spine. Ryan stepped back, his voice a harsh whisper. We're trapped. If it's outside, we can't go out the front. We can't stay here either, Jess hissed, glancing around the cabin as though searching for an escape. Claire's eyes landed on a small, broken window near the back wall. It was barely large enough for them to crawl through, but it was a way out. The window, she said quickly. If we're fast, we might be able to slip out before it notices. Without another word, she moved toward the window, her friends following close behind. The knocking had become a steady pounding now, each strike shaking the cabin, filling the air with splinters of wood and dust. One by one, they climbed through the window, careful not to make a sound as they dropped to the ground outside. The fog was thick here, swirling around them in heavy, cloying waves that seemed almost solid. As they moved away from the cabin, Claire glanced back, catching one final glimpse of the Swamp Watcher standing by the door, its hollow eyes fixed on the cabin as though waiting for them to reappear. It stood still, its body obscured by the mist, but she could feel its gaze lingering, searching. Once they were a safe distance away, they stopped, each of them breathing heavily, hearts pounding in their chests. "Where do we go now?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "The swamp just keeps changing." Claire looked around, her mind racing. She didn't know where they could go, didn't know if there even was a way out. But she knew they couldn't stop moving, couldn't let the Watcher trap them. "We keep going," she said, her voice steady, though fear gripped her heart. "We can't let it catch us. We just have to keep moving, keep looking for an escape." Her friends nodded, their faces pale, eyes hollow with exhaustion and terror. But they followed her, clinging to the faint hope that somewhere, somehow, a way out existed. As they ventured deeper into the swamp, the shadows grew darker, the fog thicker, pressing close like a living thing, hiding secrets within its depths. The whispers returned, floating around them like a mournful song, filling the air with broken words, half-remembered pleas, and the ever-present call, "Come back." With every step, Claire felt the swamp pulling her down, binding her to its depths. She could sense it in the shadows, in the trees, in the very air she breathed. The swamp wanted them, needed them. They moved through the swamp like shadows themselves, barely speaking, each consumed by the same unrelenting fear. The fog pressed in thicker than before, muffling sound, making it impossible to tell where they'd come from or where they were going. The swamp twisted around them, creating new paths only to close them off moments later, like a living maze that adjusted to their every step. Claire felt her mind fraying, the damp chill seeping into her bones. She kept glancing behind her, half expecting to see the Swamp Watcher emerging from the mist, its hollow eyes fixed on her, pulling her back with its silent call. She clutched her arms tightly around herself, shivering as the soft, taunting whispers surrounded them once again. "Come back." It was different this time. Closer, sharper, the voice no longer just an echo in the distance. She glanced at her friends, each of them looking as strained as she felt. Jess's face was drawn, her eyes darting nervously between the trees, while Marcus walked with his arms wrapped around himself, flinching at every shadow. Ryan led the group, jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed with grim determination, but even he looked shaken. "Do you hear that?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. Ryan stopped, his hand tightening around the branch he used as a makeshift weapon. "Yeah, but ignore it. It's trying to mess with us, make us panic." "Too late for that." Jess muttered under her breath, but she kept moving, her footsteps quick and unsteady. The whispers grew louder as they continued, each voice overlapping the next in a chorus of despair. Claire could feel them in her head, digging into her thoughts, filling her with a gnawing sense of dread and longing. It was as if the swamp itself wanted to consume her, to pull her into its depths and never let her go. Finally, they reached a small clearing, an open space in the tangled mess of trees and mud. The fog was thinner here, giving them a brief respite from the stifling gloom. Ryan stopped, glancing around, his shoulders tense. "Let's take a break," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to figure out our next move." Claire sank to the ground, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The swamp felt like it was draining the life out of her, each step heavier than the last. She could feel the Watcher's presence all around them, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, waiting. "Does anyone have any idea how to get out of here?" Jess asked, her voice laced with desperation. "Because we can't keep wandering like this. It's like we're walking in circles." Ryan shook his head, a bitter edge to his voice. "It's this place. It doesn't follow any rules. We're not lost because we're going the wrong way. We're lost because the swamp wants us to be lost." Claire shivered, hugging her knees to her chest. She had known, deep down, that the swamp was keeping them trapped, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more hopeless. "What about the cabin?" Marcus whispered. "The journal. It said something about the Watcher, that it feeds on the lost and broken. Maybe it's waiting for us to give up, to lose hope." A heavy silence fell over them, each of them considering Marcus's words, the terrible truth that lay beneath them. The swamp wanted their despair, their fear, their surrender. It was toying with them, savoring their terror, feeding on it. Claire took a shaky breath, her mind racing. "If that's true, then we can't give in. We have to keep going, even if it feels like we're lost. even if we have no idea where we're going. Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze meeting hers. You're right. As long as we don't give up, as long as we keep moving, maybe we can break free. A faint glimmer of hope sparked in Claire's chest, fragile but undeniable. She nodded, feeling a renewed determination, a quiet, stubborn resolve to survive, to make it out, no matter what the swamp wanted. They rose, dusting the mud off their hands, and continued through the clearing, their footsteps heavy but resolute. As they passed through the trees, the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent, each voice dripping with malice. Come back. You cannot leave. The ground grew softer, more treacherous, pulling at their feet like quicksand. The swamp felt angry, the trees bending in, their twisted branches like clawed hands reaching for them. Claire's pulse quickened, and she pushed forward, fighting against the sensation that the swamp was closing in, tightening around them. Suddenly Jess stumbled, letting out a sharp gasp as she fell, her foot caught in a tangle of roots. Claire turned back, reaching for her friend, but froze as she saw something moving in the shadows behind Jess. A figure emerging from the fog, tall and skeletal, its eyes gleaming with a terrible, unnatural light. It was the Watcher. "Jess, get up!" Claire cried, her voice choked with fear. Jess scrambled to her feet, her face pale as she looked back, her eyes widening as she saw the Watcher standing there, its hollow gaze fixed on her. She stumbled back, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. It's real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's real." The Watcher tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, as though savoring the moment. Its gaze shifted, moving from Jess to each of them in turn, lingering on Claire with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Ryan stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Leave us alone," he shouted, his voice filled with a desperation that echoed through the swamp. "We're not afraid of you." The Watcher's face twisted into a grotesque smile, a sickening expression that seemed to stretch its hollow features even further, as if mocking him. It took a step forward, its movements slow and fluid, like a shadow sliding across the ground. Ryan clenched the branch in his hands, lifting it defensively, but his confidence wavered as the Watcher drew closer, its empty gaze unwavering. "Ryan, don't!" Claire started, but her words were cut off as the Watcher raised one long, skeletal finger, pointing directly at Ryan. In an instant, the world around them shifted. The fog thickened, swirling in a violent, chaotic dance, and Claire felt a strange, disorienting pull, as though the ground itself was falling away beneath her. When the fog cleared, they were no longer in the clearing. They stood in a place that seemed to defy reality, an endless expanse of water and trees, twisted and distorted, stretching on forever. The swamp was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a realm that shifted and changed, bending to the Watcher's will. What is this?" Marcus whispered, his voice breaking as he took in their surroundings. The Watcher stood a few yards away, its form shifting, blending with the shadows, its gaze locked onto them with a terrible intensity. Claire could feel its power, its control over this place, the way it seemed to pull at her mind, her senses, filling her with a growing dread. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice filling the air, echoing from all directions. "You belong to the swamp, to me." Claire felt the weight of those words, the truth that lay beneath them, pressing down on her like a physical force. She could see it in the Watcher's eyes, the knowledge that they were trapped, bound to this place, prisoners in a world of shadows and fog. But something inside her rebelled against it, a fierce, stubborn refusal to surrender. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "You don't own us." The Watcher's gaze narrowed, its face twisting in a look of faint amusement, as if her defiance was nothing more than an amusing game. But she held her ground, meeting its gaze, refusing to look away. Ryan, Jess, and Marcus gathered around her, each one filled with the same desperate determination. They stood together, a small island of resistance in a sea of darkness, their fear replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. The Watcher's expression darkened, its form shifting, growing larger, more imposing, as though it were drawing power from the swamp itself. The ground beneath them trembled, the trees bending in, their branches twisting and writhing, filling the air with a low, haunting whisper. "Come back. Give in." The words echoed through their minds, filling them with a deep, overwhelming sense of despair. Claire felt her resolve waver, her knees weakening as the swamp's power pressed down on her, relentless and unyielding. But then she felt a hand on her shoulder, Jess's, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. She looked at her friends, saw the fear in their eyes, but also the strength, the refusal to give up. They were still themselves, still together. With a final surge of determination, Claire took a step forward, defying the Watcher, defying the swamp itself. "We're leaving," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You don't own us." The Watcher's face contorted in rage, its form darkening, twisting, as though the shadows themselves were writhing within it. It reached out. The Watcher's hand extended toward them, each finger long and skeletal, dripping with swamp muck that fell in thick, oily globs, hissing as it hit the ground. The fog around them churned, thickening into a suffocating cloud, pressing in from all directions like walls closing around them. Claire's chest tightened, as though the air itself was conspiring against them. The Watcher loomed larger with each passing second, feeding off their fear, its hollow eyes fixed on them with a hunger that was almost tangible. The oppressive weight of the swamp's ancient dark power settled over Claire and her friends, each of them trembling, fighting for breath. She could feel its pull, like the swamp was dragging them down, binding them to its roots and mud, trying to swallow them whole. But Claire refused to give in. She took a step forward, her fists clenched, her gaze never wavering from the Watcher's hollow eyes. "You don't own us," she repeated, her voice fierce. "You can't keep us here." The Watcher's twisted face contorted in anger, its form shifting, growing darker, more monstrous. The shadows around it writhed, as if the swamp itself was boiling with fury, but Claire held her ground, every muscle in her body taut with determination. Her friends followed suit, standing shoulder to shoulder, their expressions defiant. Jess was the first to speak, her voice trembling but resolute. "We're not staying here. This isn't where we belong." Marcus nodded, a fire in his eyes that Claire hadn't seen before. "You may control this place, but you don't control us." Ryan stepped forward, raising the makeshift branch he held as a weapon. "We're leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." The Watcher's eyes narrowed, its shadowed form rippling with anger, as if the swamp itself was furious at their defiance. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that resonated through the fog, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. The trees around them twisted and contorted, their branches bending toward the group like skeletal arms reaching to snatch them back. "Enough!" The Watcher's voice echoed, a bone-chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling their minds, drowning their thoughts in a wave of despair. "You are mine. You belong to the swamp, to me." But instead of retreating, Claire felt a surge of strength rise within her, a fire that burned hotter with every word of defiance. She took another step forward, reaching out her hand to her friends. "We're stronger together," she whispered, loud enough for only them to hear. "If we stay united, it can't break us." Her friends joined hands, forming a circle, their faces set with determination, their breaths shallow but steady. The whispers of the swamp grew louder, an endless chorus of voices calling to them, taunting them, filling their minds with fear. But their grip held firm, their defiance like a beacon in the darkness, a spark of hope against the Watcher's unrelenting power. The fog around them began to swirl faster, spinning in dizzying patterns, and Claire could feel the Watcher's influence trying to pierce their defenses, filling their minds with dark thoughts, images of despair, of each of them lost, drowning alone in the swamp. But then something changed. In the silence that followed their defiance, Claire heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a heartbeat. Soft, steady, growing stronger with each pulse. It was her heartbeat, and it was also the heartbeat of the others. Their lives intertwined, a rhythm of life that pulsed with their will to survive, their desire to escape. The Watcher recoiled, its form flickering, the shadows that made up its body wavering as though it was losing its grip on the physical world. Its hollow eyes widened, a look of confusion and rage flashing across its face as if it had underestimated them. Ryan squeezed Claire's hand, a fierce smile on his face. "Let's make a run for it," he whispered. With a nod, they broke their circle and sprinted forward, weaving through the trees, their feet pounding against the damp ground as they pushed through the fog. The swamp seemed to scream around them, the whispers rising to a deafening roar, but they kept moving, refusing to look back. The trees began to blur, the fog thinning, the ground feeling more solid with each step. Claire could feel the weight lifting, the oppressive pull of the swamp weakening as though something had broken, some ancient force losing its hold on them. But then, just as they neared what felt like the edge of the swamp, the Watcher appeared directly in their path, blocking their way. Its face was twisted with fury, its form larger, more monstrous than ever. Each limb stretched unnaturally long, dripping with muck and twisted roots. It reached out, its shadowy hands moving to ensnare them, its eyes blazing with rage. "You cannot escape me," the Watcher bellowed, its voice a roar that shook the trees. Claire's heart pounded, her mind racing as she searched for something, anything that could save them. She looked at her friends, each one frozen in fear, and then back at the Watcher, its terrible form bearing down on them, hungry and relentless. And then, in a final, desperate surge of courage, Claire let go of her fear. She stepped forward, locking eyes with the creature, her voice steady as she whispered, "You can't keep us here. We don't belong to you. We don't belong to this place." The Watcher paused, its gaze fixed on her, as though her words had struck a nerve, a crack in the facade of its power. For the first time, the creature seemed uncertain, as though her defiance had shaken something fundamental within it. A thought struck her, a realization that the swamp's power was tied to their belief in it, or to their fear. If they could let go of that fear, if they could truly believe in their right to be free, maybe, just maybe, they could break the hold the Watcher had over them. "Don't be afraid," Claire said, her voice filled with a strange calm as she looked at her friends. "That's what it feeds on, our fear, our doubt. But if we believe we're free, if we hold on to our hope—" "Ryan, touch us," and Marcus nodded, each of them summoning every ounce of courage they had left. They closed their eyes, focusing on that one simple truth. They didn't belong to the swamp. They belonged to each other, to their own lives, to a future beyond this darkness. The Watcher's form flickered, its edges blurring, the shadows that made up its body unraveling like smoke. Its hollow eyes widened in horror as it realized it was losing its grip on them, its power slipping away. "No," it shrieked, its voice filled with desperation, but the sound was weaker now, fading as the swamp itself seemed to recoil, pulling back, releasing its hold. The fog thinned, the darkness lifted, and the trees around them grew clearer, their twisted shapes returning to something familiar, something real. The swamp was losing its grip, its ancient power unraveling as the Watcher's form dissolved into the mist, its final scream echoing through the air before fading into silence. And then, suddenly, they were free. They found themselves at the edge of the swamp, standing in the pale early morning light. The mist was gone, the swamp quiet and still, its malevolence lifted, leaving only the ordinary sounds of birds and insects filling the air. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the weight finally lift from her chest. She looked at her friends, each one of them looking as shocked and relieved as she felt, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings, finally truly free of the swamp. "We made it," Jess whispered, her voice choked with disbelief. We're out." Marcus let out a shaky laugh, a sound filled with equal parts relief and exhaustion. "I can't believe it. We actually made it." Ryan clapped Claire on the shoulder, his face filled with gratitude and pride. "You saved us, Claire. We'd still be there if it weren't for you." Claire smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "We saved each other," she said quietly. "We never gave up. That's what got us through." They stood in silence for a moment, each of them taking in the quiet beauty of the forest around them, the sunlight filtering through the trees, warm and real. The memory of the swamp lingered, the shadows and whispers still vivid in their minds, but they knew it was behind them now, a nightmare they had escaped. With one final look back, they turned away from the swamp and began their journey home, their footsteps steady and sure, their spirits light. But as they walked, Claire couldn't shake the faint, lingering feeling that somewhere in the depths of the swamp, the Watcher still watched, still waited. It would never truly disappear, never release its grip on the land, but they had broken free, and that was enough. And as they disappeared into the trees, the swamp settled into silence once more, its shadows deep and still, waiting for the next travelers brave or foolish enough to venture into its depths.